January 3rd, 1889, Turin, Italy. A 44-year-old philosophy professor walks into the Piazza Carlo Alberto and sees a horse being whipped by its owner. The professor throws his arms around the horse's neck, sobbing uncontrollably. Then he collapses. His name was Friedrich Nietzsche. Within 48 hours, he would be in a psychiatric clinic. Within 2 weeks, he would be catatonic. He would spend the next 11 years alive, but completely insane, unable to recognize his own work, unable to form coherent sentences, drooling and muttering in fragments. The man who wrote "God is Dead" and predicted the nihilism of the 20th century never recovered. But here's what most people don't know. Nietzsche didn't just lose his mind randomly. He systematically destroyed it himself. For the past decade, historians and neuroscientists have been piecing together what actually happened in Nietzsche's final years, and the evidence suggests something far more disturbing than a simple mental breakdown. This was a deliberate pattern of self-destruction, fueled by drugs, isolation, malnutrition, and a philosophical project that may have literally rewired his brain. Let me show you how a genius philosopher engineered his own cognitive collapse. Friedrich Nietzsche was born in 1844 in Rücken, Prussia. By age 24, he was the youngest person ever appointed to the chair of classical philology at the University of Basel. By 30, he'd already published his first major work, The Birth of Tragedy. His academic trajectory was extraordinary, but in 1879, at age 34, Nietzsche resigned from the university due to chronic health problems. Severe migraines, vision problems so bad he could barely read, digestive issues that left him vomiting after nearly every meal. From that point forward, Nietzsche became a wanderer. He spent the next decade moving between cheap boarding houses in Switzerland, Italy, and southern France, living on a small pension, completely alone except for occasional visits from his sister and a few friends. And this is where things get interesting. Because Nietzsche wasn't just writing philosophy during these years, he was conducting an experiment on himself. In his private notebooks from this period, which weren't published until decades after his death, Nietzsche explicitly describes his philosophical work as a form of self-transformation. He writes about pushing his mind to its absolute limits, testing whether a human being could think their way beyond conventional morality, beyond Christianity, beyond the herd mentality of European civilization. But he wasn't just thinking about these ideas, he was trying to embody them physically. Here's what we know about Nietzsche's daily routine during the 1880s, based on letters to friends and his own journal entries. He would wake up at 5 a.m., write for 3 to 4 hours without stopping, take a 2-hour walk regardless of weather, write for another 3 hours, take another walk, write again until he couldn't see anymore. He barely ate. A typical meal was bread, an apple, and weak tea. Sometimes he'd go an entire day on just coffee and rusks. He was deliberately depriving his body, convinced that physical discomfort sharpened mental clarity. And then there were the drugs. Nietzsche was consuming massive quantities of chloral hydrate, a sedative and hypnotic drug. It was his primary treatment for insomnia and migraines. The problem? Chloral hydrate is incredibly neurotoxic, especially in high doses over extended periods. It causes cognitive impairment, hallucinations, and, in severe cases, permanent brain damage. We know from his pharmacy records, which survived, that Nietzsche was purchasing chloral hydrate in quantities that would alarm any modern physician. We're talking about doses that would be considered dangerous even for short-term use. He was taking it almost daily for years. But that wasn't all. He was also using opium tinctures for pain, potassium bromide as an anticonvulsant, and a rotating cocktail of other 19th century medications that we now know are toxic. His letters describe experimenting with different combinations to see which ones allowed him to write longer without mental fatigue. Think about what he was doing. This wasn't medical treatment. This was self-administered neurological experimentation with zero medical supervision. And it's getting worse, because at the same time Nietzsche was poisoning his brain with sedatives and opiates, he was also subjecting himself to extreme sensory deprivation. He would spend months at a time in near-total isolation. In Sils-Maria, Switzerland, he rented the same tiny room every summer from 1881 to 1888. The room was barely large enough for a bed and a desk. One small window, no heating. He described it as a cave. His landlady later reported that she would go days without seeing him. He'd have food left outside his door. Sometimes it would sit there untouched. Neuroscientists today understand that prolonged social isolation causes measurable changes in brain structure. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision-making and emotional regulation, physically shrinks. The amygdala, which processes fear and anxiety, becomes hyperactive. The hippocampus, crucial for memory formation, deteriorates. Nietzsche was essentially creating the perfect conditions for neurological breakdown. Toxic drugs, malnutrition, isolation, chronic pain, and sleep deprivation. But here's the disturbing part. He knew what he was doing. In Ecce Homo, one of his final books written in 1888, just before his collapse, Nietzsche writes explicitly about self-overcoming through suffering. He describes his life as an experiment in how much pain a human being can endure and still create. He argues that greatness requires destroying one's own health, one's own peace of mind, one's own sanity. "I am not a human being," he writes. "I am dynamite." But the question everyone asks is this: was Nietzsche's madness caused by his self-destructive lifestyle, or was something else happening? Because there's another theory, one that's been debated by medical historians for over a century. The official diagnosis, made by doctors in Basel shortly after his collapse, was progressive paralysis. That was 19th century medical terminology for late-stage neurosyphilis, tertiary syphilis that attacks the brain. This made sense at the time. Syphilis was epidemic in 19th century Europe. It was incurable, and the symptoms of tertiary neurosyphilis matched Nietzsche's decline almost perfectly: delusions of grandeur, mood swings, paralysis, dementia. The story goes that Nietzsche contracted syphilis in 1865 when he was 20 years old, visiting a brothel in Cologne. There's one piece of evidence for this: a letter to a friend where Nietzsche vaguely alludes to visiting a house of ill repute during his university years. For over 100 years, this was the accepted explanation. Nietzsche had syphilis. He knew he had it. He watched it slowly destroy his brain over 2 decades. The end. But here's the problem. The evidence doesn't actually support this. In 2003, a team of German neurologists and historians did something no one had done before. They went back and reviewed every piece of medical documentation from Nietzsche's hospitalizations. Doctor's notes, intake forms, treatment records, everything. And they found something shocking. There's no record of any doctor actually testing Nietzsche for syphilis. The diagnosis of progressive paralysis was based entirely on symptoms and the assumption that he must have contracted it at some point. More importantly, Nietzsche's symptom progression doesn't quite match neurosyphilis. His collapse was too sudden. Tertiary syphilis typically takes 15 to 20 years to reach the dementia stage, and it progresses gradually. Nietzsche went from writing lucid, brilliant prose to complete cognitive collapse in less than 3 months. Plus, there's another issue. Nietzsche's final writings, the ones he produced in the months before his breakdown, aren't the rambling, incoherent mess you'd expect from someone with advanced dementia. They're some of his most stylistically sophisticated work. The Antichrist, Ecce Homo, Twilight of the Idols, all written between September and December 1888, just weeks before his collapse. They're aggressive, grandiose, sometimes unhinged, but they're not incoherent. The prose is sharp, the arguments are structured. This doesn't fit the profile of tertiary neurosyphilis. So, what actually happened? Modern neurologists who've studied Nietzsche's case now believe he likely suffered from a different condition entirely. The leading theory is CADASIL, a rare hereditary stroke disorder that causes progressive dementia, migraines, and psychiatric symptoms. CADASIL stands for cerebral autosomal dominant arteriopathy with subcortical infarcts and leukoencephalopathy. Basically, it's a genetic mutation that causes the small blood vessels in the brain to progressively fail. It typically manifests in midlife with severe migraines, which Nietzsche had since his 20s. It causes strokes, which can be sudden and catastrophic, and it leads to vascular dementia. This would explain why Nietzsche's father died at age 36 of what was described as softening of the brain, a 19th century term for stroke or dementia. It would explain Nietzsche's lifelong migraines. It would explain the sudden onset of his final collapse. But here's where it gets really dark. Even if Catasil was the underlying cause, Nietzsche's lifestyle absolutely accelerated it. Remember the chloral hydrate? It's a vasoconstrictor. It narrows blood vessels. If you already have compromised cerebral blood flow from Catasil, flooding your system with a drug that restricts blood flow even further is catastrophic. The malnutrition, the isolation, the stress of constant intellectual labor, all of it would have made everything worse. So, whether it was Catasil, neurosyphilis, or a combination of factors, one thing is clear. Nietzsche destroyed his brain through his lifestyle. Now, let's talk about what happened after January 3rd, 1889, because the story gets even stranger. After Nietzsche collapsed in the Piazza Carlo Alberto, his friend Franz Overbeck rushed to Turin to retrieve him. Overbeck found Nietzsche in his apartment, alternating between catatonia and mania. At one point, Nietzsche told Overbeck he was the successor to the dead god. He sang, he danced, he screamed. Overbeck took him to a psychiatric clinic in Basel. The intake notes describe Nietzsche as suffering from megalomania and confusion. He was convinced he was multiple people. He signed letters as Dionysus and the Crucified. He claimed to be having affairs with Cosima Wagner and various other prominent women. None of it was true. The doctors tried various treatments, cold water therapy, restraints, sedatives. Nothing worked. After a few months, Nietzsche's mother took him back to her home in Naumburg. He would spend the rest of his life there, and later with his sister in Weimar, completely dependent on care. For 11 years, Nietzsche existed in a state of profound mental absence. He could walk if guided, he could eat if fed, but he couldn't read, he couldn't write, he couldn't hold a conversation. Visitors reported that he would sometimes mutter fragments: mother, fire, too late. His sister, Elisabeth Forster Nietzsche, became his caretaker and the manager of his intellectual estate. And this is where things get ethically complicated. Elisabeth had her own agenda. She was a German nationalist with anti-Semitic views, the opposite of her brother's actual philosophy. While Nietzsche lay incapacitated, unable to defend his work, Elisabeth began editing his unpublished writings, selectively publishing fragments, and positioning Nietzsche as a proto-fascist thinker. She compiled a book called The Will to Power, supposedly Nietzsche's magnum opus, by cherry-picking notebook entries out of context. She removed sections where Nietzsche explicitly condemned anti-Semitism and German nationalism. She added emphasis where there was none. By the time Nietzsche died on August 25, 1900, at age 55, he had become a celebrity philosopher he wouldn't have recognized. The Nazis would later adopt him as a philosophical hero, which is one of history's most bitter ironies. Nietzsche spent his career attacking German nationalism, criticizing anti-Semitism, and mocking the idea of racial purity. But he couldn't defend himself. He'd been silent for over a decade. So what's the truth about Nietzsche's madness? Here's what we can say with confidence. Friedrich Nietzsche was likely born with a genetic predisposition to cerebrovascular disease. He suffered from severe chronic migraines and vision problems from an early age, symptoms consistent with Catasil or a similar vascular disorder. But he also made choices that accelerated his decline. He consumed neurotoxic drugs in dangerous quantities. He isolated himself socially and sensorially. He deprived his body of nutrition and rest. He pushed his mind to exhaustion daily for years. He deliberately sought out suffering because he believed it was necessary for philosophical greatness. Whether he would have collapsed anyway is impossible to know, but his lifestyle turned a slow degeneration into a rapid catastrophe. And here's the uncomfortable question. Was Nietzsche right? His philosophy argues that greatness requires self-destruction, that comfort and safety are the enemies of profound truth, that to think beyond the boundaries of conventional morality you have to be willing to sacrifice your own well-being. He lived that philosophy to its absolute limit, and it destroyed him. But in the process, he produced some of the most influential ideas in Western philosophy, ideas that shaped existentialism, postmodernism, and the entire trajectory of 20th century thought. So was it worth it? Can we separate the brilliance of the work from the horror of how it was created? These aren't easy questions, but they're the questions Nietzsche himself would have wanted us to ask. The man who wrote, "That which does not kill us makes us stronger," died a shell of himself, destroyed by the very principles he preached. He wanted to become something beyond human, and in a way he did. He became a warning about what happens when philosophy becomes self-experimentation, when ideas become obsessions, when the search for truth becomes indistinguishable from self-destruction. Friedrich Nietzsche lost his mind because he chose to burn it out in the service of his ideas. Whether that makes him a genius, a madman, or both, is something history is still trying to figure out. If you found this disturbing, you should probably subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from. Thanks for watching.